your grace still amazes me. Your grace still amazes me. It's deeper, it's wider, it's stronger, it's higher, it's deep, it's deep, it's wide, it's wide, it's strong, it's higher than anything my eyes can see. Your grace still amazes me. Your love is still a mystery. Each day I fall on my knees, 'cause your grace still amazes me. Your grace still amazes.
Okay, good evening, everyone. We can't wait too much longer. We're already a couple minutes behind, waiting for folks to come in to sing and uplift their voices tonight. So if you'll recall, Sunday night, all of you that were here, one of the main themes that we had, that we spoke about on Sunday, and we even had a little bit of a, of history of the hymns time, we talked about grace, okay? And, you think about grace, and if you really think back through the Word of God, God's been showing and imparting grace almost since day one. If you think about all of the trials and stuff, even what we've been studying, with the people of Israel and so forth, how God, grace is beyond unbelievable, kind of, we'd stand upon it, and so forth and so on. Well, tonight we're going to continue that with our next song that we're going to sing, and the scripture verse that I wanted to quote you, Romans chapter 5 and verse 20b, okay? And the scripture says, "But where sin abounded, grace did much more abound." And that's where it was written there. Take time sometime just to read that whole chapter. It's pretty awesome. The comparison of Adam and how he brought sin in the world, and how the law shows us how bad of a sinner we really are and the need that we have of Jesus. But then how God's grace is more abundant and more efficient, and the finished work of Jesus on the cross paid for our sins. So tonight we're going to sing together, "Wonderful Grace of Jesus." Everybody pick your part and sing nice and loud. It's probably better if we stood up, right? We could sing out, and we could sing a little louder and go. Wonderful grace of Jesus, greater than all my sin. How shall my tongue describe it? Where shall its praise begin? Taking away my burden, setting my spirit free. How the wonderful grace of Jesus reaches me. Wonderful the matchless grace of Jesus, deeper than the mighty rolling sea. Higher than a mountain, sparkling like a fountain, all sufficient grace for you and me. Broader than the scope of my transgressions, greater far than all my sin and shame. Oh, magnify the precious name of Jesus, praise his name. Wonderful grace of Jesus, reaching the most defiled, by its transforming power, making him God's dear child, purchasing peace and heaven for all eternity. Wonderful the matchless grace of Jesus, deeper than the mighty rolling sea, higher than the mountains, sparkling like a fountain, all sufficient grace for even me. Broader than the scope of my transgressions, greater far than all my sin and shame. Oh, magnify the precious name of Jesus, praise his name. All right, good singing.
Okay, hopefully I'm loud enough. Yep, seems like it. All right. Welcome, everybody. Getting out, enjoying some of the warm weather? Yeah. Winter is still going to have the last say. I'm going to cause you as much grief as I possibly can, and then maybe I'll let it warm up some more. How many of you have flowers in the yard? Daffodils, crocuses? Yeah, we did some cleaning last week. It was nice. Esther. If you've not turned there yet, I suggest you be in the book of Esther. And we're going to continue our study as we go through. Just keep in mind the outlines are available. And if I get too loud, Rich, you can turn me down just a little bit. Don't want to blow everybody's ears out. Because I really don't need the microphone if I want to speak loud. Just ask my kids, they'll tell you. Get my toys put together here. Don't have as much graphics in this week's slide presentation, but I do believe you will see some things of importance as we go through. Let's take a look at the book of Esther, chapter 1. Esther, chapter 1. Again, we're talking about the whole series overall is rebuilding the house of the Lord, your house, your spiritual center, in spite of the opposition. As you take a look around the world today, you just take a look at all of last year and what happened last year and what's beginning to happen this year. All the opposition, the circumstances, the things, you stop and take a look at it. When is the pressure going to stop? When is the opposition going to stop? I'm going to give you a clue. It's not until he calls us home. Individually or as one big group. I wouldn't mind if he does that as I finish speaking tonight, as I finish speaking now. But he has a purpose for leaving us behind. Esther chapter 1 chapters 1 and 2, serving God despite adverse circumstances. If you've read through the book of Esther, you know or are familiar with some of the things that she had to encounter. Some things to keep in mind. Something we have to keep in mind at all times is as we look through any passage to the scriptures, you have to keep in mind the time frame, the circumstances, the culture, the things going on there, and be careful not to put your culture into that time frame. Well, they shouldn't be doing that. Well, it was different then. If you've been watching any of the news since last year, they've gone through and they're changing the names on schools. Washington, Lincoln, removing them because they're controversial. What? That's our forefathers. That's the foundation. But the most troubling thing is they're not remembering that was a different culture and society at that point in time. And we've learned from that to not embrace some of the negative things today. But because they're so caught up in change, for the sake of change, they're stopping to realize that they're removing a legacy to help remind the children as they're growing up, adults, that no, that was wrong, some of the things they did. But look at the great things they accomplished in spite of the adversity and circumstances they went through. So we have to be careful, because Christians can get caught up in this stuff. A change just for the sake of change, when what is the foundation we've got to draw upon? The one thing we have to look to is this right here. Everything has to go through that. Last week we talked about some troubling situations and issues that they recommended. Divorce, the bill of divorcement. You have to stop and remember, when we get into the culture of that time frame, it was totally different. What does the Bible say? Follow it through. Search it out for yourself to know what God says. So as we read Esther chapter 1, I'm just going to read a few verses here. Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, this is Ahasuerus, which reigned from India even unto the Ethiopia, over 127 provinces. That would be about 127, I think. If you stop and turn it around. Sometimes we got to stop and think on these numbers and how to rearrange it. We've talked about that before, and I'll bring up another slide of how expansive this empire was. In verse 2, that in those days, when the king Ahasuerus sat on the throne of his kingdom, which was in Shushan, the palace, in the third year of his reign, he made a feast unto all the princes and his servants, the power of Persia and Media, the nobles and princes of provinces being before him. When he showed the riches of his glorious kingdom and the honor of his excellent majesty many days, even 180 days. That's a long time. Almost 6 months, 180 days roughly. That's a long time. We'll get into the reasoning behind that. And that's what you've got to try to understand as you read through these. Who is this King Ahasuerus? Is he somebody we know about? Yeah, he's in secular history when you read through. So keep that in mind. The writer of wrong finger, hit the I instead of the if. The writer of Esther is unknown. We do not know who wrote. And if I remember correctly, I don't believe the word God is mentioned at all in Esther. However, as Stephen mentioned, grace. You stop and take a look through Esther, you find God's grace throughout. Even though his name is not mentioned, his grace certainly shows up and is manifested. The writer of Esther, he had intimate knowledge and familiarity with the imperial court of Ahasuerus, also known as Xerxes I. He reigned from 486 to 464 BC as the Persian king. As you can see, this is a very expansive empire, running from Ethiopia all the way over to India, in that area. Susa, also known as Shushan, there by Babylonia, that name. That is where the capital, that's what we're looking at here, is where this king is having his feast. Now there's 127 provinces from east to west, north to south, spread out. That's a lot of territory. And he has 7 princes or administrators of these areas. Just like we talked about before, we have governors for our 50 states set up to govern those regions underneath the corporate control of the king. As you take a look here, Ahasuerus, the son of Darius, down the bottom, you see Esther's story begins. He was, Darius, the son of Darius the first, Ahasuerus, he's identical with the Greek name of Xerxes. So there's different names as you're looking through secular history, looking through biblical history. Some of these names are interchanged. You have to keep in mind which one you're talking about, especially looking at the time frames to make sure you're looking at the right king, emperor, or person involved. Again, another one that shows on how it's all laid out. Esther chapter 1, Queen Vashti is rejected. So as we get into this individual was familiar with the royal household, the imperial court, very intimately. He knew the ins and outs. He knew how the court was laid out, how it acted. So it gives an impression that this person seemed to have been involved with the king's court, being a Jew as well. So keep that in mind. The events cover about 12 years in Susa or Shushan, the capital city. King Ahasuerus, son of Darius I, identified as Xerxes or Darius Hystaspes. Now, if you've read through the book of the Bibles, you found some names that are repeated over and over and over again. Bear in mind which one applies where, and try to keep it separated. That's what Darius, Xerxes the first, the second, etc. So keep in mind. He had a great fleet that was defeated by the Grecian fleet at Salamis about 480 BC. Now, something to keep in mind. He had a massive fleet. And the boy got spanked by the smaller Grecian fleet. And he didn't like that. These Greeks took him down a notch or two and showed him that he wasn't as big and powerful as he thought he was. As you can see on the map here, this is the battle of around 480, 479 BC, in which he was defeated. It's also the same region in which additional issues arose. Scholars speculate the gathering of these nobles, the 180 days that King Ahasuerus had gathering of all these nobles, was a military planning operation against the Greeks. Since he got defeated that last time, he's now getting everybody together and says, okay, what are we going to do to bring these Greeks under our control, to defeat them? So they're speculating that, as it's recorded here, this is a gathering of these groups. The campaigns that ensued after this, 481, 479, they didn't prove out to be as productive as they thought. So again, this might be a beginning of seeing of this kingdom beginning to crumble because it's not as dominant and controlling as it once was. So as we get your outline out, take a look. We're going to go through, hopefully, all these quickly tonight. Yep, I should be able to. We'll see how it goes. Keep in mind, this is something else we have to keep in mind. Esther, Nehemiah, as well as Ezra, a lot of these things, these dates, they overlap, especially with Ezra and Esther. The events recorded here in Esther occur between the events of Ezra chapter 6 and Ezra chapter 7. Because there was a gap in there, if you remember correctly, about 60 years from the temple's completion and Ezra's return. Temple was finished, it was completed, and then the naysayers and complainers of the land complained to the king and said, hey, these guys keep going, they're going to cause you trouble. So they convinced the Persian king at that time to stop the construction. Temple was done, but the rest of the city, the walls and everything else, had not been completed yet. So it was approximately 60 years from the temple completion, if you remember right, till Ezra returned in order to begin reinstalling the proper temple worship. Because we talked about how he was looking at a spiritual reformation within the people's hearts and minds. How long did the king's gathering of the advisors last? 180 days, about 6 months. What occurred at the end of this gathering? How many of you read through that, Esther? What happened at the end of this 180-day gathering that the king had? All of his military advisors and counselors. Anybody remember? Called his wife. Diane? Called his wife. He called his wife. And who was his wife again? Vashti. Held a king, lasted 7 days, a lot of celebrations. Now looking at the downfall of Vashti, as you outline in Romans, number 1 is downfall of Queen Vashti. As the king's extended gathering of leader ends, the final feast was 7 days. And like I said before, keep in mind that the events that occurred was approximately 60 years between the events. So who is Vashti? Who is she? Have any idea? Is she in secular history? Sure she is. In history, she's also known as Amistria, maybe. Greeks regarded her as the only legitimate wife of the king. However, something that most of us overlook, later recorded as regaining her former dignity and possible position as queen. So keep that in mind as we go through the outline. So we'll take a look at this feast that the king had. And boy, did he have a feast. Can you imagine a party going on for 6 months? Do you think that was all they did for that 6 months? No, probably not. When the Persian kings allowed the Jews to return to their homeland, many did not. Why? Because many of them are well off. There's been 70 years that they've been here, and more now. We're doing fine financially. Why should I leave? I'm in comfort zone. And that's what some of these are. That's why Esther was here, and Mordecai, and some of the others as we get to talking about them. This is in the third year of his reign, and he holds this party, 6 months, gathering a leader. Like I said, military advisors, we do not have anything definitively stating that was the purpose of this 6-month gathering, to establish battle plans against the Greeks. But from what the secular scholars and others have been able to define and discern, that was the main reason, which would make sense. Now, why have it for 6 months? Yes. She's speculating that one of the reasons was they did not have everyone there at one time, is they had to rotate them through, which is one of the points we'll be getting to here in a minute. As the king was holding his banquets, Vashti was also holding her banquets with the women that attended, the dignitaries. And one of the reasons was, why would you have these 127 provinces, all these princes and leaders come to the capital at once? Who is in charge back home? Would they be able to maintain proper control? Maybe, maybe not. So the reasoning is very logical, and I hold to that thought myself, is you have this 6-month time period, because one, how fast can you travel from one end of the kingdom to the capital? It's going to take a while someplace, especially if you're over in Ethiopia. You got to go up and around the Horn, up to the Euphrates, and come back down. Just what? Take about 4 months, 5 months, just for the Jews to reach Jerusalem from Babylon? Can you imagine from Ethiopia? So yes, it would take time. And yes, they would come in stages to ensure that they had sufficient authority and control back in their provinces. Does that make sense? So in B, the enforcement of the king's authority. I don't get too far ahead of myself. Keep in mind that this 7-day party banquet was at the end of that 6 months. So whatever dignitaries were there at that point in time will be attending this final banquet. I'm assuming he's gotten his battle plans together and he's instructed his various people what's going to happen. I'm going to need these troops here or this ships here, whatever it's going to be for his military plans. Like all kings, all leaders, they want to show off what they've got, all their possessions. And what was his one final item that this king wanted to show off? His wife. Why would he want to show off Vashti? So beautiful. From what we know from history, she's very beautiful to look upon, very pleasing to the eye. Something to keep in mind, as I understand, about this particular king was that he was known for his lascivious lifestyle. Very unruly in some ways. Temper, yeah. A lot of those things go in. Yeah, pride is another good one she's mentioning. So he wanted to show off Vashti. How did he request Queen Vashti to appear before him? Let's take a look in verse 10 of chapter 1. It said, on the 7th day, so it's the last day of this banquet, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal, to show the people and the princess her beauty, for she was fair to look on. He wanted her fully decked out. Now you got to stop and think. Women just can't say, okay, I'm ready to go. It's going to take time. It's the 7th day of the day, and you call me to do this now? I should have known this at the beginning of the week. I would have had all week to get ready. I get the gown pressed, I get this done. I got to go get the jewelry all polished up. I might be exaggerating, but you get the idea. It's going to take time, especially if he wants you to come in the full royal apparel to include the crown jewels. It's going to take time. And then it's going to be Vashti's beauty to top all this off. When you look through the scriptures and how it's reading about how King Ahasuerus talked and felt about Vashti, I believe personally he was in full love with this woman, not only for her beauty, but for some other characteristics about her that drew them together for whatever reason. But he was so proud of her, especially the beauty, because she represented him and the kingdom, a capstone that he was cherishing. Again, what condition was the king in? Merry with wine? What does that seem to imply, merry with wine? He's probably drunk. Yeah. How did Vashti, we'll get to that drunkenness in a few minutes. How did Vashti respond? She said no. Any idea why? Why would she refuse to go before the king? Yeah, she's probably seen him in a drunken fervor before and didn't want to have any part of it. Most likely. Been married for a while, so I'm sure she has. Didn't like it. What's some other reasons that she may not have? Yeah, that's not one of your trophies. You know, you get these big hunters, you know, and they want to go show off the trophies. We have one friend out in Montana. He had to find a house that would fit his one trophy, which was a moose. They also had a bear, too, a full-size bear that he had stuffed. So he had to find a house that had a double door wide enough to open up to allow the moose with its antlers to come through to get mount this thing. He likes showing off his trophies. And Vashti may have felt that same way. I wouldn't have felt like, no, you just want to show me off. You just want to show me as some kind of prize and trophy for you, and that's not what I am. Once she was entertaining her guest, you've given me this responsibility. I've got the female wives and others other dignitaries that I'm supposed to be entertaining, and now you want me to be drawn away from them? That's not right for them. Didn't like being shown off as a trophy. Do you think there might have been a possible restraint in the relationship? What would give you that kind of an idea? Yeah? So I heard something else? Six months of partying, having nothing to do with it? It's a possibility. I don't believe during that 6 months that it was all partying. I'm sure it was interspersed within that time period. Because, you know, that 6 months is a lot of partying, but there's probably a lot of business meetings going on with those dignitaries coming in. But yeah, I'm sure there was a lot of partying like they would do at the end of a day. Who knows? What does verse 10 say there? Who did he send? Now, chamberlains are his confidential. Let me see if I can find my notes on that one. There it is. Chamberlain, a confidential servant of the king. Quite often they're regarded as being one of the most personal confidants within the king's chambers, responsible for guarding the king, sort of like the Secret Service, so to speak, in some ways, where they would see and know of a lot of particulars. So the inner sanctum of the king, in the royal palace and his chambers, they were responsible for. And 7 of them are mentioned here, plus some others later, but 7 of them mentioned here. He sends these 7 chamberlains to go and fetch Vashti. Personally, I don't have anything proof, but that gives me the impression that yes, there may have been a strain in the relationship. So he sends these 7 men who probably were also knowledgeable of her and had a good relationship with her, who might have been able to persuade her to come at his request. The speculation on my part, but when you stop and take a look at all the pieces and when they start fitting together, there are some problems in this marriage. And alcohol was one of them. How did Azarus feel? How do you think he responded? Oh, man. I think the term was, but the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore, was the king very wroth. Translation, angry. And the anger, what? So what does that phrase seem to imply? He was a hothead, like was mentioned earlier. He had a temper on him. You also add to that the alcohol. He was angry. He was rejected, betrayed, challenged. Ooh, why would he be challenged? Why? Yeah. What did he do? He sought advice and counsel. What kind of advice and counsel? Now remember this time period, they also looked at a lot of astrologers, magicians, these other kind of people to get as much of the spiritual influence, astrological influence, to give him guidance, you know. Who knows, they may have rolled dice or bones or something to figure out how it comes up. Maybe read the T at the bottom of cups or something like that. Maybe read the palms. Who knows what these guys did? They were different. Then the 7 princes of his province, the main 7 advisors. The first thing he lists is the advisors, the astrologers, the magicians, and then these 7 other advisors of the king were brought in. What should I do? How should I respond to her rejecting my request to come before me? Stop and think. What was the key problem that they were discussing and trying to identify with Vashti's refusal to come before the king? Challenge to his authority. Very important. The queen had refused the king's command to appear before him. What type of social order was present at this time? Diane had already mentioned it. The women were subordinate to the men. It was a man-dominated society. And in some parts of the world, that hasn't changed much, regrettably. There are women that are far capable of doing a job than some men. But yet, because of a man's pride and ego, he won't let them do the job, which causes a lot of problems, especially in marriages. God made man and woman. He took woman out of the man. So the woman does what? He completes the man. There are some things that a woman brings to the relationship that the man has got to have. How many guys have told their kids when they got hurt, suck it up, just deal with it, even though they got a limb hanging at an awkward angle? We've all done that. We've had issues with our kids. So guys, we're just tough. Suck it up. Deal with it. But the women are more compassionate. And that's how God made them, to balance us each out. And this society, they had some problems. What resolution was recommended? What solution was brought to the king on how to deal with this transgression of this queen? Yes? A decree that the women would have to listen to the man, the authority, husband. That's part of it, yes. Who recommended this decree? Verse 15, I believe. The Chamberlains. Verse 19. What's that? Memucan? Me-mu-can. 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 We got to have fun with some of these names. If you can pronounce it, go for it. The recommendation was by Prince Memucan, one of the 7 princes of the various districts, that if Vashti's actions were left unchecked, unpunished, it would encourage the women across all levels to challenge the male authority and revolt. Is that a possibility? Sure it is. Doubtful. I got my own personal opinion by why Memucan brought that up, but we'll go there later. What condition was Ahasuerus again? What was his physical condition then? Merry with wine, drunk. When a person is under the influence of alcohol, or even drugs, but alcohol in this case, what is usually their capacity for thinking? Is it clear? Is it logical? No. You couple that alcohol with his anger, his wrath, and it was a very heated anger that he had, very deep into his core. When a person is angry, do they think clearly? Do they think logically? Do they listen to anything being said? No. Many times when people get like that, we've had it with some of our kids, when they get like that, just having a temper tantrum, we just have to let it run. So they finally calm down and gain control of their senses, and they stop and listen to what you're saying. They realize, oh, yeah, you're right. But until they're to that point, they're not going to listen to you because the anger has got their mind blocked to thinking anything that is logical and correct. Yes?
So he was very impressionable to others when he was in that state, so how many other things?
Logical, controlled thinking, compromised, and as you just brought up, he was easily swayed by those around him because he's so angry, so wroth, and mad at her for challenging his authority. He was going to listen to anything without stopping to evaluate fully the consequences of all of it. He recommended that she be stripped of her royal position. Prince Memucan, you need to remove her from being queen. And she should no longer be able to come before the king. Now, this could be banishment, could also mean execution. But we know it wasn't execution because she was still around. When the king of the Medes and Persians established a decree or a law, can it be revoked or changed? No. That was one of the sayings of the Medes and the Persians. When that was done, it's irrevocable. It can never be changed. Does it make sense? No, not logically in some cases. Because why would you make a law that, when you stop and look at the merits of it? Do we have some of those laws on our books today? Can we get them undone? We can, but the challenge of getting it done, once it's in the books, it's hard to get it undone. The lawmakers, well, they're just lawmakers. Yeah, especially when you take a look who's in control, what's going on. Let me get over to my right page here. Being slow and turning my pages, sorry about. Oh, there we go. Not too far behind. Being stripped, royal, could mean banishment or execution. It was not execution at this stage, but she was banished from coming before the king at all. I did not find any of that. As to whether she still continued to live in the palace in a separate household. May have been banished to another small part of it to where she couldn't leave anything. Being the queen, and from where she was at, I would think she may have had some control of a family line somewhere of authority, but that's speculation on my part. So when the Medes and Persians made a law, no, it could not be changed. So this law was approved, it was done, it was sent to all the provinces and translated into their languages to where everybody knew about it. The queen defied the king. She was banished, can no longer come before the king anymore. He's divorced her, she's gone. And if you do not obey your authority, your husband, the male, whatever, you're going to be punished in similar fashion. This would achieve Memucan's goal, let the women know that they must be submissive to their husbands. Again, a male-dominated, women-subordinate society. Any thoughts as to why he felt this way? I think I already gave away my thought. I think he had feelings that his wife wasn't being submissive to him. This is maybe inferiority complex. You know, some people are that way. They just don't feel confident in themselves to be able to lead. And it might be how they lead that causes them the problems. What do you think about Vashti's decision to defy the king's wishes, her husband? Do you think they're right? Foolish underneath that era and time period. So you're saying that she did not really want to, but because of his way he was doing it, wasn't showing God's position accordingly? Maybe she was thinking he would forgive her. Yes, because if the love relationship was strong and powerful as it seemed to be indicated, her thinking, okay, I refuse to do this, it may cause him to stop and think, no, and forgive her afterwards. So yes, that's a possibility. And as we look through the scriptures in chapter 2 and verse 1, there's an indication of that being one of the issues that was in his heart when he became sober and started thinking clearly. How should a Christian husband relate to his wife? In love? Should he dominate over her? Make her do what he wants? No. In a marriage relationship, you're working together because you each have your own personality, each have your own thoughts, each have your own thinking. And it takes time with a marriage for you to finally start thinking alike because you grew up in two different households with two different influences, multiple different influences coming into your life. So when you finally come together, there's several years where you have conflict because she's thinking this way, you're thinking that way, and it doesn't match up for some reason because of a different understanding sometimes of what this phrase means or what this action means. It takes time to understand, to agree to disagree sometimes, but to agree to change. Not biblically, because maybe you're thinking about it as way off base. Your way of thinking is fine, but is the other way wrong? No. Could be better. Maybe your modification of the two together comes to a better understanding. So you should treat with love, respect, consideration. The woman is the weaker vessel, physically especially. But they're the most sensitive spiritually than men. There are things that my wife is sensitive to that I'm not. I have learned to yield to her. Because for whatever reason she has just an instinct on something. That person, I just don't know about him. And later on we'll realize, yeah, there was something not right. Can't understand it, can't put your hands on it, but each of us have that kind of an instinct, and some of that is because of how we were raised, what we were exposed to, giving us a sixth sense, so to speak, to situations. You need to be wise to that, sensitive to that, to yield to her. So as we get down to Roman numeral 2 of our outline, the rise of Queen Esther. Might have to wrap this up here shortly. I don't want to go too long. Do you think Ahasuerus regretted his decision concerning Vashti? Let's read chapter 2 and verse 1. After these things, when the wrath of the king, so that means he's finally sober, his anger had subsided, the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased. He remembered Vashti and what she had done and what was decreed against her. So you think he had some hard misfeelings about making the rash decision? Because personally, that was a rash decision that he made. He listened to these advisors when he was not in the right frame of mind. He allowed them to influence him to make a decision. And he regretted that decision. Because he, as Mr. Jakubek has said, he loved her. But because he made this decree that the Medes and Persians cannot undo, he couldn't go back and change it. So he regretted that decision. Could he change the law? No. He's now without a queen. What would he do? He would go about finding a replacement for this queen. How do you think the young girls, how did he go about finding a replacement? In verse 3, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces in the kingdom, that they may gather together all the fair young virgins unto Shushan the palace, to the house of the women, to the custody of Higi, the king's chamberlain, keeper of the women, and let their things for purification be given them. So throughout the whole kingdom, province, all the young virgins were sought out, beautiful, whatever, and then they were brought. How do you think those young girls felt? How do you think the parents felt? the family and the friends. Some were probably terrified. Some were probably excited. Getting away from, or getting up to the king, enthralled by, oh, I'm going to the king, to the palace. I don't know. By today's standards, what would we consider that to be? I see your lips trying to move there, Vince. What would you think it to be? What? Slavery? Prostitution? That's to name a few. And are those things prevalent in today's society still? Around the world, yes. Even within our own country. Don't be fooled by that. It's still prevalent in here, and something we need to pray about and work on if we can, if at all possible. So, who is Esther? She was a Hebrew. Her name was Hadassah, meaning myrtle. That was her Jewish name. Her other name here was Esther, which means star, referring to the Venus star, because of her beauty. She was a cousin to Mordecai. We've heard the name Mordecai. We get more about him. I'll have to end it here in just a moment. Mordecai raised Hadassah after her parents had died. He came over, his parents came over with the Nebuchadnezzar in that one deportation, and her parents died. He took her in and raised her as his own child, even though she was just a cousin. Why was she chosen? Because of her great beauty, personal beauty. That was going to be the drawing factor in all these virgins that were sought out, was their physical beauty. Would they be able to match up with Vashti? Probably not in the king's heart, but that's what the goal. What process did Esther and the other women go through? A 12-month, two-phase purification. Health spa, beauty spa, special foods, whatever it was, to get them to be the most beautiful physically, maybe inside. Personally, I believe it was also a vetting process to make sure where this person stood in support of the kingdom, etc. Did Esther ever reveal her nationality, that she was a Jew? To our knowledge, no. Mordecai had instructed her, do not let him know, anybody know, that you are a Hebrew. What did Mordecai do during this time period? He repeatedly walked past the court of women seeking to know of Esther's welfare. What do you think that says about Mordecai? Do you think he had love for? Yeah. Cared deeply for this young child. Want to make sure. He may not have had any choice of her being selected to go, but he yielded. Verse 15, and we'll wrap up here shortly. Verse 15, now when the turn of Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her for his daughter, to go into the king, she required nothing but what Haggai, the king's chamberlain, the keeper of the women, appointed, and Esther obtained favor in the sight of all them that looked upon her. When she went into the king's harem, so to speak, Haggai, or Haggai, as he pronounced here, is a different spelling. He took a liking to her. He would be a chamberlain who had some intimate knowledge of the king and probably Vashti as well. And he took a liking to this young lady, as she would be one that would fill the position of queen, meeting what the king was looking for. Only what he had appointed. And when did Esther go before the king? What time period would this be in his reign? In verse 16, so Esther was taken unto King Ahasuerus into his house, the royal, in the 10th month, which was the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Do you think it's important for us to know that God put months and references in here for us? Do you think it's important for us to do that? Yeah, it gives us a time frame which we can take and correlate to what's going on in secular history with the king's reign. So between December 479, 478 BC, something like that, corresponds with the 7th year of Ahasuerus' reign. And that's important to understand as to when it falls in place in there, because there's some timing in this thing. Is remember, he's got this battlefront with Greece that he's dealing with, He had all these advisors come. He got rid of his queens, and now he's got to put everything together. He's got a battle. He's got to go back and fight with the Greeks, battle with the Greeks again. So there's a lot going on in his life. And he wants to have this settled before he leaves onto that journey. So who was Mordecai? A Benjamite, a eunuch, a member of the king's court, possibly what we might consider be a prime minister, maybe, representative of the Jews. I'm sure the king knew that Mordecai was a Jew, a Hebrew. He was not just some humble porter, but he had a position of importance. According to the Institute of Cyrus, all state officers were required to wait in the outer courts, possibly what they call here in Esther the King's Gate, till they were summoned into the presence chamber. In other words, they sat outside of the gate, the chamber of where the king would hear for laws and rules and things going on, until they were called by the king to come in. Now remember, you can't go into the courtroom in the king's presence unless he calls you and summons you in. We'll see that later on in Esther as we get there. So he had a position of importance of he's sitting outside this chamber. He wasn't just some simple porter. He had a position of authority. So he would have an intimate knowledge of the imperial court. Who are Bigthan and Teresh? It's mentioned in, where did we see that one at? Verse 21, in those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, two of the king's chamberlains, again, those who would be his close security, responsible for the king's personal protection, standing at the gate, the doorway going into the inner chamber of the king's presence, these guys are standing. So guards, security. Okay, keep that in mind. Bigthan and Teresh, those that kept the door. Eunuchs, most likely guards, is my understanding. Again, I believe they were responsible for his personal security. So these guys hung close. Just like the Secret Service that had the presidential detail, they are responsible for being with the president at all times, one or two or three, however many is assigned throughout the day and weeks. What were they guilty of? Plotting to kill the king. Why? Why would they be conspiring to kill the king? Oh, by the way, I forgot to tell you, conspiracies to overthrow a king were very prevalent during this time period. They had no problems. If somebody could get in and kill the king and take his position, they were going to do it in a heartbeat. So just give you a heads up. Any thoughts or ideas as to why? They were wroth about something, but what would that something be? Any thoughts? If they were responsible for the king's inner chamber and security, what other knowledge might they have? Do you think they might have a familiarity with Vashti? Maybe she was a very kind and loving person, and they did not like the way she was treated. I personally think that might have been some of it, as well as some of the scholars that I've looked at. They think that might have been why they were upset, because of how Vashti was treated, and they didn't feel that it was right. Mordecai, in verse 21, was outside the door. He overhears this conversation. Now remember, Queen Esther, she's now been assigned queen. She now has the king's ear. She can now share things with the king. Whereas before, she didn't have that opportunity. Mordecai shares the information with Esther. Esther shares it with the king. King investigates it. Now, she shared this information with the king in Mordecai's name, which means he had a position of authority. Which means the king was going to take time to listen. Okay, if Mordecai, one of my advisors in the Jewish realm, whatever it might have been, says something's up, I'm going to take note of it. So the king investigates and finds out, yes, the murder plot had validity to it. It was written into the king's books, and that's important later on. The events of Mordecai bringing this to the king's attention, and those two conspirators being punished and put to death. They were hanged. What does this suggest us about Mordecai's example, about respecting our government authorities? He's a Jew. Do you think he really liked King Ahasuerus? He may not have liked him, but he respected the position. The Persian kings still were dealing with the Jews in a respectful way, allowing them to return to the homeland to worship the way they felt they should be according to the Bible. So he may not have liked the king per se, but he had respect for the position. How many of you have a respect for our president, the person in the position? How do you have a respect for the position? Being former military, there are times when I had officers over me that I detested. But because of the position they were in, I had to respect them and honor their wishes accordingly. You need to respect when you stop respecting the authority that is placed over you, that is going to cause a lot of grief and downfall later on that cannot be undone. So next week, we'll continue in the series. What was the last one? Well, I'll just give it to you. B was Mordecai discovers a plot. Mordecai, if you didn't get that written down, Mordecai discovers a plot. He overhears that plot and he shares it with the king through Esther. Next week, we're going to take a look at chapters 3 and 4. I urge you to read through that. And the important thing is others' interests before your own. Why did Mordecai do this? Why did he present this information? Because, one, it was for the royal position. As Steve gets ready to come up, I'll wrap up with this. He felt it was important to serve the king, in spite of maybe not liking what the king was doing, but it was what had to be done to maintain order. Yes, Steve? Yeah, Steve was mentioning that the way Queen Vashti was treated and how everything was set up was part of God's plan. And yes, I agree with you. I believe that God allowed these events to happen against Vashti to bring Esther into position for a reason which we'll see as we continue through this study. So yes, it's very important. In all this, God's name is not mentioned in the book of Esther, but we can see his grace and his providence moving through a very intimate and very personal way. Steve? Get my toys and get out of the way.